My brother kicked me out in a storm. He stood in the doorway of the house I paid for, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster, while the Georgia rain lashed against the porch and turned the manicured lawn I spent 3 years perfecting into a soup of red clay and broken dreams. My brother kicked me out in a storm, and my mother didn't even look up from her tea. It was a Tuesday, the kind of humid, heavy afternoon where the air feels like a wet wool blanket, and the sky over the Atlanta suburbs had turned a bruised shade of purple before the clouds finally ruptured. I stood on the driveway, my silk blouse clinging to my skin, watching Preston heave my life into the mud. He threw the black plastic trash bags with a rhythmic, joyful violence, each one landing with a wet thud that echoed against the brick veneer of the villa. Those bags contained my designer suits, my professional certifications, the expensive linens I'd bought to make this place feel like a home, and the small, fragile memories of a woman who had spent 15 years being the unpaid architect of her family's survival. "Get out, Gemma!" Preston shouted, his voice cracking with a frantic, unearned authority that made my stomach turn. He was 29 years old, a man who had never held a job for more than 6 months. Yet here he was, reclaiming a kingdom he had never laid a stone for. "This is my house now," he sneered, waving a crumpled piece of paper that I knew was a forgery before he even opened his mouth. "Mom and Dad signed it over. We don't need your charity, and we certainly don't need your attitude. You've been looking down on us from your high horse for too long, acting like you're the only one who knows how to handle money. Well, the golden boy is back in charge, and my fiancé needs the master suite." I looked past him, into the warm, amber-lit interior of the foyer. My mother, Barbara, was sitting on the velvet settee I'd imported from Italy. She was meticulously polishing a silver spoon, her eyes fixed on the metal as if the secrets of the universe were etched in its reflection. Beside her, my father, Richard, was staring at the television, the blue light washing out the features of a man who had long ago traded his spine for a quiet life. Neither of them looked at me. Neither of them told him to stop. It was the silence that cut the deepest, a thick, suffocating indifference that told me I was no longer a daughter or a sister, but a utility that had been decommissioned. For years, I had been the one they called when the property taxes were due, when the roof leaked, when Preston's car was repossessed, or when the refrigerator was empty. I was the strong black woman, the dependable Gemma, the one with the high-paying audit job who could always find a way to make the numbers work. I had been their bank, their lawyer, their maid, and their therapist, and in return, they had developed a deep, simmering resentment for the very hand that fed them. They hated me for my success because it reminded them of their own stagnation. They hated me for my discipline because it highlighted their chaos. And so, when Preston came to them with a plan to take back the family legacy, they had eagerly participated in his delusion. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel and how many people around the world connect with them. Have you ever been the person who holds everything together only to be treated like an outsider in your own home? I stood there, the rain dripping from my eyelashes, and I felt a strange cold clarity wash over me. It wasn't anger. Anger is loud and messy. This was something different. It was the feeling of a heavy chain finally snapping. I looked at the house, the 5-bedroom, 4-bath Georgian-style house that I had meticulously renovated over the last 2 years. I looked at the new floor-to-ceiling windows Preston had already begun to alter, the structural beams he had recklessly ordered the contractors to remove so he could have an open-concept ballroom for his engagement party. He had no idea. He had no idea that the deed he held was a worthless piece of theater. He had no idea that I hadn't bought this house in my own name, but through a complex layering of a private LLC called GT Heritage Holdings. He had no idea that every penny of the mortgage, the insurance, and the permits was tied to a corporate entity he couldn't even spell. Most importantly, he had no idea that the renovations he was currently overseeing, the ones he was paying for with credit cards he'd opened in our father's name, were systematically compromising the structural integrity of the entire building. He was literally destroying the roof over his head, and I was the only person with the power to stop the collapse. But as I watched him kick my last suitcase down the porch steps, I realized I was done stopping collapses. I had spent my entire life catching people who didn't want to learn how to fly. I reached down and picked up the suitcase, the leather soaked and heavy. My movements were slow, deliberate, and infused with a grace that infuriated him. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't point out that the house was legally mine. I simply looked at Preston, then at the two silhouettes of my parents behind the glass. I saw my mother finally look up, her eyes meeting mine for a fleeting second before she turned back to her silver. In that gaze, I saw the transactional nature of her love. I was only valuable to her as long as I was a provider. Now that Preston had convinced her he was the new source of wealth, I was an inconvenience. "Fine," I said, my voice barely audible over the roar of the rain, yet it carried a weight that made Preston's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. "If this is what you want, Preston, then it's yours. All of it. I hope it's everything you imagined." I turned my back on them and walked toward my car, a black Mercedes that was also owned by the LLC. I felt the weight of their eyes on me, the mixture of triumph and hidden fear. They expected me to break. They expected me to call the police or start a scene so they could play the victims and tell the neighbors about their difficult daughter. They wanted the drama because it would justify their cruelty. When I gave them nothing but silence, I took away their victory. I climbed into the driver's seat, the engine humming to life with a soft, expensive purr. I sat there for a moment, the heater blowing against my frozen fingers, and I looked at the digital dashboard. I had 3 missed calls from my attorney Sterling and a notification from my bank. Preston had already tried to change the mailing address on the main accounts. He was moving fast, driven by a desperate greed that blinded him to the most basic realities of the law. He thought he was playing chess, but he didn't even realize he wasn't on the board. I pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel I'd had delivered just last month. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. Preston was standing in the middle of the rain-slicked lawn, raising his arms in a gesture of grotesque celebration, a king of a kingdom made of cards. He didn't know that the contractors he'd hired were already calling me about unpaid invoices. He didn't know that the wall he'd knocked down yesterday was a load-bearing pillar that kept the master suite from sagging into the kitchen. He didn't know that by the time the storm cleared, he wouldn't just be facing a sister he'd betrayed. He'd be facing the full, cold machinery of a corporate eviction and a criminal fraud investigation. I drove through the winding streets of the subdivision, past the manicured hedges and the glowing street lamps, feeling the crushing weight of 35 years of strength beginning to lift. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to fix it. I wasn't going to call the contractor and pay the bill. I wasn't going to apologize for being the one who was right. I was going to let the storm do its work. I pulled into a quiet parking lot a few miles away, the rain still drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. I took out my phone and dialed Sterling. He answered on the first ring. "Gemma," he said, his voice grave. "I saw the filings. Did he really try to use that forged deed at the county office?" "He did," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of the shaking I felt in my soul. "And he just kicked me out of the house." Sterling was silent for a long moment. "What do you want to do? We can have the sheriff there in an hour. We can shut this down before the sun comes up." "No," I said, watching a single lightning bolt fracture the dark horizon. "Let him have his party. Let him invite his friends. Let him show off his new house. I want him to feel exactly what it's like to own something he didn't build. And then, Sterling, I want you to execute the lien on the renovations. I want the LLC to pull the occupancy permit due to the structural hazards he created. I don't want a sister's revenge. I want an auditor's reckoning." I hung up the phone and leaned my head back against the leather headrest. I thought about the house, The way the light hit the breakfast nook in the morning, the way I had carefully picked out the crown molding to honor the history of the neighborhood. It was just wood and stone. The real foundation was me, and I had just walked away. As the wind rocked the car, I felt a strange sense of peace. They thought they had left me with nothing, but they had actually given me the one thing I never would have given myself: permission to stop caring. The storm was just beginning, and for once, I was the one watching it from the safety of the shore. I thought about my mother's silver spoon and my father's blue-lit face. They had chosen the golden boy's glitter over the daughter's gold. They had no idea that the house they were so eager to steal was already a hollow shell, held together only by my grace. And that grace had just run out. I put the car in gear and drove toward the city, toward a hotel they didn't know about and a future they couldn't touch. Tomorrow, the legal notices would start arriving. Tomorrow, the structural engineers would realize the danger. But tonight, I was just a woman driving through the rain, finally carrying a weight that belonged only to her. The road ahead was dark, but my vision had never been clearer. I remembered the way Preston had looked as he threw those trash bags, the sheer, unadulterated entitlement in his eyes. He really believed that because he was the son, because he was the one they had always shielded from consequences, the world would simply bend to his will. He believed that my silence was a sign of weakness, that my refusal to engage in his petty squabbles was a sign that I had no fight left. He had spent his whole life watching me build things, and he assumed that building was easy. He didn't understand that the same hands that know how to lay bricks also know how to pull the thread that unravels the entire tapestry. I arrived at the hotel, a sleek modern tower in Buckhead where the staff knew me by name. I didn't look like a woman who had just been evicted. I looked like a woman who was closing a deal. I checked in, the lobby smelling of expensive oud and fresh lilies, a world away from the damp red clay of the suburbs. When I got to my room, I didn't cry. I went to the bathroom, peeled off my ruined silk blouse, and stepped into a hot shower. I washed the rain and the mud and the memory of my brother's voice off my skin. I stood there until the steam filled the room, thinking about the LLC. GT Heritage Holdings wasn't just a tax shield, it was a fortress. I had set it up years ago when I first started seeing the way Preston looked at my bank statements. I knew, even then, that the day would come when my family's greed would outweigh their loyalty. I just hadn't expected it to happen so spectacularly. I hadn't expected my parents to sign a forged deed, essentially trying to steal from the person who had kept them out of debt for a decade. The sheer illegality of it was breathtaking, but the emotional betrayal was what made it final. As I dried off and put on a plush white robe, I sat at the small desk in the corner of the room. I opened my laptop and began to look at the security camera feeds from the house. I watched the screen as the storm continued to batter the property. There was Preston, moving my expensive furniture around, dragging a heavy mahogany sideboard across the hardwood floors I'd told him never to scuff. I saw his fiancée, Kiara, walking through the rooms with a glass of red wine, pointing at things as if she were a queen surveying her new domain. She had no idea she was walking on a floor that was literally sagging an inch every hour because of the support beam Preston had removed in the basement. I watched them for a long time, not out of malice, but out of a cold, analytical curiosity. It was like watching an experiment in real time. How long does it take for a house to fall when the foundation is removed? How long does it take for a family to realize they've traded their soul for a ruin? I saw my father enter the frame, looking older and smaller than I remembered. He looked at the spot where my bags had been, then looked away. There was no regret in his posture, only a tired sort of relief that the conflict was over. He didn't realize the conflict was just beginning. I closed the laptop. I had a lot of work to do. I needed to authorize the structural inspection for the morning. I needed to notify the insurance company that unauthorized, unpermitted work was being performed by a third party. And I needed to make sure that when the house was eventually condemned, I was the one holding the keys to the only place they would have left to go. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, I was going to sleep. I lay down in the oversized bed, the silence of the hotel room a sharp contrast to the screaming wind outside. I thought about the small girl I used to be, the one who always made sure Preston's homework was done so he wouldn't get in trouble, the one who worked 2 jobs in college so my parents wouldn't have to worry about the mortgage. I whispered a quiet apology to that girl. I was sorry it took so long to realize that some people don't want to be saved, they just want to be served. My brother kicked me out in a storm, but as I closed my eyes, I realized he had actually done me a favor. He had pushed me out of a burning building before I even knew the fire had started. The storm outside was loud, but inside, for the first time in 35 years, it was perfectly, beautifully quiet. The morning light in Buckhead was sharp and unapologetic, slicing through the heavy blackout curtains of my hotel suite like a surgeon's scalpel. I woke up before the alarm, my body still tuned to the rhythm of a woman who had spent 15 years balancing the world on her shoulders. For a split second, I reached for the space on my nightstand where I usually kept the household ledger, the physical manifestation of every bill, every repair, and every whim my family had ever presented to me. Then the memory of the rain, the mud, and the forged deed flooded back, and my hand settled on the cold, polished wood of the hotel furniture. I didn't feel the panic I expected. Instead, I felt a strange, crystalline stillness. I lay there for a moment, listening to the muffled hum of the city waking up below me, and I realized that the house in the suburbs was no longer my responsibility. If the roof leaked this morning, it wasn't my problem. If the lawn was a swamp, it wasn't my concern. I got out of bed and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling canopy of Atlanta. I was 35 years old, a senior auditor at one of the most prestigious firms in the Southeast, a woman who could dismantle a billion-dollar corporate fraud case in a weekend. Yet I had allowed my own family to treat me like a disposable utility. I went through the ritual of my morning with a precision that was almost meditative. I showered, using the expensive soaps I usually saved for special occasions, and I dressed in a charcoal gray power suit that fit like armor. I spent extra time on my hair and makeup, ensuring that the woman who stepped into the elevator was a masterpiece of professional composure. No one would ever know, by looking at me, that I had been evicted from my own home 12 hours ago. As I drove to my office, my mind began to do what it does best. It began to audit. I started with the numbers. I had bought the villa 3 years ago when the market was low and my parents' house was being threatened with foreclosure because of my father's investment in one of Preston's failed tech startups. I hadn't just paid off their debts, I had moved them into a brand new life. I had created GT Heritage Holdings, specifically to keep my assets separate from the family's chaos. I knew back then, even in the midst of my generosity, that their gratitude was a perishable good. I remembered the day we moved in. My mother had walked through the kitchen, touching the quartz countertops with a look of possessive hunger. "This is what we deserve," she had whispered, "not this is what you've given us, Gemma." That was the first red flag, one I had ignored in my desperate need to be the good daughter. Before I dive deeper into how they managed to forge those documents, tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like the more you give to your family, the less they actually see you? Is it possible for a mother to truly love a daughter she only views as a resource? I arrived at my office, the glass and steel building a sanctuary of logic and order. My assistant, Kiara, not to be confused with Preston's fiancé of the same name, handed me a stack of files and a large coffee. "You look especially sharp today, Miss Turner," she noted, her eyes lingering on the set of my jaw. I gave her a small, tight smile. "It's a day for precision, Kiara." I went into my office and closed the door. I didn't start my work for the firm. Instead, I pulled up the private server for GT Heritage Holdings. I needed to see exactly what Preston had filed at the county office. It took me less than 10 minutes to find it. He had submitted a quit-claim deed, supposedly signed by me and witnessed by my parents, transferring the property from the LLC to his personal name for the sum of $10. The signature on the line for the managing member of the LLC was a clumsy imitation of mine, but it was accompanied by a notary stamp that I recognized. It belonged to a woman named Sheila, a longtime friend of my mother's who ran a small tax business out of her basement. They had conspired. They had sat around a kitchen table, likely laughing and drinking wine, while they stole the roof over my head. My mother had provided the inside information, my father had provided the moral cover, and Preston had provided the audacity. They truly believed that because the house was the family home, it didn't matter who paid for it. In their minds, my success was communal property, but their failures were mine alone to fix. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Henderson, the general contractor I had hired 6 months ago to finish the basement. He was a good man, a veteran who took pride in his work, and he was the only one who truly knew the bones of that house, besides me. "Gemma?" he said, sounding frantic as soon as he heard my voice. "I was just about to call you. Your brother, he's losing his mind. He came in here this morning and told my crew to stop work on the waterproofing. He wants us to tear out the main support columns in the center of the basement. He says he wants an uninterrupted floor space for some big party next week. I told him those columns are holding up the entire east wing, including the master suite where your folks sleep, and he just laughed. He said he's the owner now, and if I don't do what he says, he'll sue me for breach of contract." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold logic of the audit settle into my bones. "Mr. Henderson, listen to me very carefully. Are you on site right now?" "I am," he said, and I could hear the sound of a jackhammer in the background. "My guys are waiting for my word." "Don't touch those columns," I said firmly. "In fact, I want you to pull your entire crew off the job immediately. Pack up your tools and leave. But Gemma, the contract is with GT Heritage Holdings, Mr. Henderson, not Preston Turner. And as the sole owner of that LLC, I'm officially suspending all work on the property due to safety concerns. I will pay your kill fee for the day and the remaining balance of the current phase. But I need you to do one more thing for me. I need you to document every instruction Preston gave you this morning. Record his voice if you have to. Then I want you to call the county building inspector. Anonymous tip. Tell them there's unpermitted structural work being done that threatens the integrity of the building." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're sure about this, Gemma? That house is your baby. It was my baby, Mr. Henderson. Now it's a crime scene. Just do it." I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. I could see the board clearly now. Preston's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He wanted the prestige of the house, but he lacked the patience or the intelligence to maintain it. He was a man who lived in the now, unable to see the consequences of the next. He had no idea that by firing the professional crew and attempting to DIY a structural renovation, he was voiding the homeowner's insurance I had meticulously maintained. He was also triggering a series of building code violations that would eventually lead to the house being red tagged. I opened a new spreadsheet and titled it, The Reckoning. I listed every bank account, every co-signed loan, and every utility bill I had been paying for them. I had given Preston a credit card for emergencies 3 years ago. I checked the balance. He had spent $6,000 in the last 48 hours on catering deposits, designer clothes, and a deposit for a luxury car rental. He was spending my money to celebrate stealing my house. With 3 clicks, I reported the card as stolen. I didn't just freeze it. I closed the account and requested a full fraud investigation. Since the card was in my name and he was merely an authorized user whose permission I had just revoked, every subsequent attempt to use it would trigger an alert to the local police. Next, I turned my attention to my parents. I had been paying for their health insurance, their cell phone plans, and the lease on my father's truck. I didn't cut them off immediately. That would be too loud. Instead, I transferred the billing responsibility to their names, using the power of attorney I had held for years to assist them with their finances. They wouldn't notice for a few weeks, not until the past due notices started piling up on the kitchen counter that they no longer had a right to sit at. I spent the rest of the morning working for my firm, my mind operating at a terrifying level of efficiency. My colleagues commented on how focused I seemed. They had no idea I was currently dismantling a family. At lunch, I sat in a small cafe and watched the security feed from the house on my phone. The rain had stopped, and the sun was out, but the yard was still a mess of red mud and my discarded belongings. I saw my mother come out onto the porch, looking at the trash bags Preston had thrown there. She hesitated for a moment, then she picked up one of my silk dresses that had fallen out of a bag. She looked at it, felt the fabric, and then, to my absolute lack of surprise, she draped it over her arm and went back inside. She wasn't looking for me. She was shopping in my ruins. A sharp pang of grief hit me then, a physical ache in the center of my chest. That dress had been a gift to myself after I passed my CPA exam. It represented my hard work, my late nights, and my ambition. To her, it was just a pretty thing she could finally have because the mean daughter was gone. I closed the app. The grief was a luxury I couldn't afford yet. I needed to stay in the cold, hard space of the auditor. I spent the afternoon drafting a formal notice to vacate and a cease and desist regarding the fraudulent deed. I didn't send them through a standard courier. I had Sterling, my attorney, prepare them on his firm's most intimidating letterhead. We weren't going to file them with the court yet. We were going to hold them like a loaded gun. I wanted Preston to get fully committed to his party. I wanted him to spend every cent of the inheritance he thought he had secured. I wanted the invitations to go out to his country club friends and his fiancée's wealthy family. I wanted him to be standing at the very top of his mountain before I pulled the earth out from under him. As the sun began to set over the city, I felt a strange sense of exhaustion, but it was a clean kind of tired. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of their expectations. I was only carrying the weight of my own justice. I thought about the strong black woman trope that had been forced upon me since I was a teenager. Be the rock, Gemma. Be the anchor, Gemma. Don't complain, Gemma. Just work harder, Gemma. I realized then that being unbreakable is just a polite way of inviting people to see how much weight they can pile on you before you snap. They had expected me to snap. They had expected a scene. They had expected me to be the angry black woman, so they could dismiss my pain as a personality flaw. By walking away in silence, I had denied them the script they had written for me. I was no longer a character in their play. I was the one who owned the theater. I went back to the hotel and ordered a glass of red wine. I sat on the balcony, watching the lights of Atlanta twinkle like a million tiny diamonds. I thought about the word grace. People think grace is about being soft or forgiving, but true grace is about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone else define it. It's the quiet power of a queen who knows when to step off the throne to let the pretenders realize they have no idea how to rule. I checked my phone one last time before bed. A text from my mother. Gemma, the microwave is making a weird noise. When are you coming by to fix it? And tell Preston to stop yelling. He's giving me a headache. We expect you for dinner on Sunday to apologize for your behavior yesterday. I stared at the screen, the audacity of her words almost making me laugh. She didn't even mention the fact that they had kicked me out in a storm. She didn't mention the trash bags. She just wanted her microwave fixed and her difficult daughter back in her place. I didn't reply. I didn't block her. I just left the message on read. That silence was the first payment on the debt they owed me. Tomorrow, the building inspector would arrive. Tomorrow, the credit card company would start calling. Tomorrow, the golden boy would find out that the master suite he wanted so badly was about to become a pile of rubble. I closed my eyes and fell into the deepest sleep I had known in years. I was 35, homeless by choice of my kin, and more powerful than I had ever been. The storm had passed, but the flood was just beginning, and I was the only one with a boat. I thought about the house one more time, not as a home, but as a structural entity. I thought about the load-bearing wall Preston had targeted. In architecture, a load-bearing wall is essential. Without it, the entire system fails. In my family, I was that wall. They had spent decades leaning on me, pushing against me, and taking my strength for granted. They thought they could replace me with a prettier view and a more convenient layout. They were about to learn that when you remove the thing that holds you up, the view from the top is a very short one. I remembered a conversation I had with my father years ago, back when I bought my first car. He told me that a man's home is his castle, but he forgot to mention that a castle is only as strong as its foundation. He had raised a daughter to be a foundation, then treated her like a floor mat. As I drifted off, I realized that the hardest part of walking away wasn't the loss of the property. It was the loss of the illusion. I had wanted to believe that if I was strong enough, they would eventually love me for who I was, not just for what I could do for them. That illusion was dead now, buried under the red mud of the Georgia rain, and in its place was something much more durable, the truth. I was Gemma Turner, and I was no longer the foundation for anyone's life but my own. The audit of my heart was complete, and the balance was zero. They owed me nothing because I no longer expected anything from them. That was the ultimate freedom. I could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the hotel balcony door, a reminder that the world was still turning, still chaotic, and still beautiful. I wasn't afraid of the wind anymore. I had learned how to be the storm. In the quiet of the room, I could almost hear the sound of the house, groaning under its own weight. The wood splintering and the drywall cracking as the physics I had warned them about began to take hold. It was a slow, steady sound, the sound of an ending. And as I slept, I dreamt of a new house, one built on a hill, where the walls were thick and the doors were locked, and the only person with the key was a woman who finally knew how to keep herself warm. Wednesday arrived with a heavy humidity that seemed to coat the glass of my hotel room in a fine layer of sweat, a mirror of the atmospheric tension building between me and the people I used to call my family. I sat at the small lacquered desk, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the sharp angles of a face that had aged a decade in a single night of betrayal. To the world, I was Gemma Turner, the high-level auditor who found the missing millions in corporate ledgers. But to the legal system, I was the sole managing member of GT Heritage Holdings, LLC, a ghost entity I had spent 5 years breathing life into. I navigated to the secure portal of the county's property records, my fingers moving with a cold, rhythmic certainty. Most people don't understand the true power of an LLC. They think it's just a tax shield or a way to write off a lease. But for a woman like me, it was a fortress of anonymity. I hadn't just bought that house for my parents. I had shielded myself from their inevitable collapse by ensuring that my name was never on a public deed that Preston could track. When he forged that quitclaim deed, he didn't realize he was trying to steal from a ghost. He had forged a signature for Gemma Turner, the person, but the person didn't own the house. The entity did, and the entity's bylaws required a unanimous vote and a corporate seal he didn't even know existed. I watched the clock on the corner of my screen as it ticked toward 9 in the morning, the exact moment the county building inspector was scheduled to arrive at the villa for his anonymous check. Before we continue, let me know what you would have done in my place. Would you have called the police immediately, or would you have let the trap set itself? Let me know where you're listening from today in the comments. My phone buzzed on the desk, the caller ID showing my mother's name. I didn't answer. I knew the script by heart. She would complain about the noise the contractors were making. She would ask for a small loan to cover the flowers for Preston's engagement party, and she would subtly guilt-trip me about not being there to help. I let it go to voicemail, watching the red notification bubble appear like a small, bleeding wound. My mind drifted back to the summer I was 15, the year my father lost his job at the plant and my mother started taking in sewing just to keep the lights on. I was the one who learned how to read the utility bills. I was the one who figured out that if we kept the thermostat at 78 and only used the washing machine after 10 at night, we could save $40 a month. I had been an auditor since I was a teenager, searching for the leaks in our family's sinking ship, while Preston sat in the living room playing video games, shielded by my mother's insistence that he was just a boy who didn't need to worry his head about grown-up problems. That was when the mold of the strong black woman was first pressed onto my skin, and I had worn it like a second soul for 20 years. But yesterday, the rain had washed that mold away. I picked up the phone and dialed Sterling's office. "Sterling, I need you to move on the subcontractors," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. He told me he was already on it. He had spent the morning contacting the plumber, the electrician, and the flooring specialist I had originally hired. As I suspected, Preston had told them all that he was the new general manager and that their existing contracts with my LLC were void because the property had changed hands. He had tried to negotiate new, lower rates with them, threatening to kick them off the site if they didn't comply. They were furious, but more importantly, they were unpaid. Gemma, the tile guy, is owed $4,000, the plumber is owed $6,000, and the electrician is halfway through a rewiring job that Preston just ordered him to stop, Sterling reported. He's hiring day laborers from a parking lot to finish the job because they're cheaper. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He was putting my parents' lives at risk for the sake of a marble backsplash. "Here is the place, Sterling," I said, leaning forward. "I want GT Heritage Holdings to buy out the debt from every one of those contractors. Pay them in full right now, including a 20% bonus for their trouble and their silence. But in exchange, I want them to sign over their right to sue and their mechanics' liens to my LLC. I don't want them fighting Preston. I want my company to be the only entity he owes money to." Sterling chuckled, a dry, appreciative sound. "You're becoming your own collection agency, Gemma. That's brilliant. If he doesn't pay the LLC, you can foreclose on the gift he thinks he just stole." "Exactly," I replied. "And since he used a forged deed to claim ownership, he's personally liable for every cent of the structural damage he's causing. He's not just losing a house, he's building a prison cell one brick at a time." After I hung up, I felt a surge of adrenaline that felt more like medicine than malice. I wasn't just defending my property, I was auditing a life of lies. I spent the next 3 hours going through every joint account I had ever shared with my parents. I had been the financial overseer, which meant I had access to everything. I saw the trail of breadcrumbs Preston had left, small withdrawals of $500 here, $1,000 there, all taken from my father's retirement account that I had helped him set up. Preston was bleeding them dry to fund his golden boy lifestyle, and my parents were so blinded by his charm that they were handing him the knife. I systematically began the process of the Great Disconnection. I notified the bank that as the primary funder of the accounts, I was withdrawing my name and my capital. I didn't close their accounts, that would be too kind. I simply removed the overdraft protection that was linked to my high balance savings. If Preston tried to pull another $1,000 for his fiancée's dress, the card would decline in front of the whole store. I was removing the safety net they had mistaken for a floor. Around 2 in the afternoon, my security app pinged. The building inspector had arrived. I watched the live feed on my phone, the tiny figures moving across the screen like chess pieces. Preston was there on the porch, wearing a designer polo shirt I had bought him for Christmas, waving his arms around and shouting at the man in the reflective vest. The inspector was unmoved. He had a clipboard and a level, and he was pointing at the massive gaping hole in the side of the house where the load-bearing pillar used to be. Even from the grainy footage, I could see the tension in the inspector's posture. He spent 20 minutes in the basement, then came back up and slapped a bright orange sticker on the front door, a red tag. The house was officially unsafe for occupancy. Preston looked like he was about to have a stroke. He tried to grab the inspector's arm, but the man pulled away and pointed toward the street where a police cruiser was pulling up. The inspector wasn't there to play games. He was there to enforce the code. Because the work was unpermitted and structural, the county was threatening to cut off the power and water within 24 hours if the pillar wasn't restored by a licensed professional. I watched Preston slump against the railing of the porch, the same railing he had leaned against while he watched my bags get soaked in the rain. My phone rang again. This time it was my father. "Gemma, please," he stammered, his voice thin and trembling. "There's a man here from the county. He says we have to leave. He says the house is going to collapse. Preston says it's just a misunderstanding, but the police are here, Gemma. Where are you? Why aren't you answering your mother?" I sat in the quiet of my hotel room, listening to the man who had watched me get kicked out in a storm without saying a single word. I remembered the way he had looked at the television while Preston threw my clothes in the mud. I remember the silence of his cowardice. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "I don't live there anymore, remember?" Preston made it very clear that it's his house now. He's the man of the family. He's the one with the vision. I'm sure he has a plan to fix the pillar. "But Gemma, we don't have anywhere else to go," he pleaded. "Your mother is crying. She's packing a bag. Tell this man to leave us alone. Call your friends at the city hall. You have those connections, Gemma. Use them for us." I looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, the sun reflecting off the buildings like a promise of a future they no longer belonged to. "I did use my connections, Dad," I said softly. "I used them to make sure that house didn't fall down on your heads while you were sleeping. The inspector is there because the house is a death trap. If you stay there, you're choosing to die in Preston's ballroom. If you want to leave, you can go to a hotel. I'm sure Preston can pay for it with all that money he's been making." I hung up before he could respond. The weight of the phone felt like a mountain in my hand. I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest, and for a family built on delusions, honesty was the ultimate weapon. I knew exactly what would happen next. Preston would try to use his charm on the police. Then he would realize that the police don't care about charm when there's a red tag on a door. They would be forced to leave, likely checking into a cheap motel because Preston had already spent the emergency money on his party. They would sit in a cramped room with the smell of stale cigarettes and regret, and they would wait for me to call and save them. They would wait for the strong black woman to show up with her checkbook and her apologies, ready to be the foundation again. But they would be waiting for a woman who no longer existed. I spent the evening at a small upscale jazz club near the hotel, sipping a glass of bourbon and listening to the mournful, triumphant notes of a saxophone. I thought about the house, now dark and empty, with an orange sticker glowing on the door like a warning sign from God. I thought about the LLC documents tucked safely in my laptop bag. I had already instructed Sterling to file the lawsuit for fraud first thing in the morning. We weren't just going for the house. We were going for the gift tax penalties, the structural damages, and the legal fees. I was going to strip Preston of every asset he had ever pretended to own. And then I was going to offer my parents a choice. They could move into a small, modest apartment that I would pay for, under a strict legal agreement that Preston was never allowed to cross the threshold, or they could follow their golden boy into the bankruptcy court. I was no longer an anchor holding them in place. I was the tide, and I was going out. As I walked back to the hotel through the cool night air, I felt a sense of sovereignty I had never known. I had spent 35 years being a pillar, and all it had gotten me was a wetsuit and a broken heart. Now I was a storm. I was the very thing that had tried to break me, and I found that I liked the thunder. I got into bed, the silk sheets a soothing contrast to the memory of the rain. I checked my phone one last time. There were 16 missed calls from Preston, 10 from my mother, and a flurry of texts from his fiancée, Kiara, accusing me of ruining their lives and being a bitter, jealous spinster. I smiled at the screen. They were finally seeing me, but it wasn't the Gemma they were used to. They were seeing the woman who held the ledger, and the ledger was finally balanced. Tomorrow, the legal notices would serve as their wake-up call. Tomorrow, the contractors would officially sign over their debts. Tomorrow, the matriarch's grace would manifest not as forgiveness, but as the cold, hard justice of a woman who had finally realized that her peace was worth more than her family's comfort. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my life, the house I saw in my dreams wasn't a villa in the suburbs. It was a palace of my own making, where the only person who had to be strong was the one who was also allowed to be happy. The silence of the hotel room was absolute, a void where the noise of their entitlement used to live. I breathed into that void, filling it with my own breath, my own power, and my own quiet, elegant victory. The first 3 hours of this new life had been more exhausting than a decade of auditing, but the profit margin was infinite. I was the LLC, I was the heritage, and I was finally, irrevocably home. I thought about the nature of the strong label again. It's a trap, a linguistic cage designed to make sure the ones who do the work never ask for a seat at the table. If you're strong, you don't need a seat. You're the table itself. Everyone eats off you, spills on you, and walks away without wondering if you're tired of the wait. Preston had been eating off me for 29 years. My parents had been resting their feet on me for even longer. By removing the house, I wasn't just taking away a building. I was taking away the platform for their parasites. It was a violent act of self-preservation, a surgical strike on a cancerous dynamic. As I drifted towards sleep, I felt a deep, ancestral resonance, as if the women who came before me, the ones who had held families together with nothing but prayer and grit, were finally giving me their blessing to lay the burden down. "You've done enough, Gemma," the shadows seemed to whisper. "Now just be." And so I was. I was the silence after the storm. I was the ledger when the ink is dry. I was the woman who walked away. And in the walking, I had found the path to myself. The villa would stand or fall on its own merits now, just like the people inside it. I had done the math, and the equation was finally solved. The answer was zero. 0 obligations, 0 regrets, and 0 ways back to the way things were. The matriarch's grace was no longer a shield for them. It was a crown for me. I slept without dreaming. A deep, restorative plunge into a world where no one needed me for anything but my presence. And in that darkness, I was more brilliant than I had ever been. The realization that my family had attempted to dismantle my life was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, calculated leak that had finally flooded the basement of my soul. And as I sat in the sterile luxury of my Buckhead Hotel suite on Thursday morning, the silence was my only companion. I looked at the digital clock, the red numbers pulsing like a heartbeat, and I felt the cold, hard weight of the decision I had made to stop being the floorboard they walked on and instead become the ceiling that was about to collapse upon their heads. The transition from being the strong black woman of the Turner family to the cold-blooded auditor of their destruction was a metamorphosis that required every ounce of my professional discipline. I pulled my laptop closer, the keys cool under my fingertips, and I began the deep dive into the secondary layer of GT Heritage Holdings, the layer that even my attorney Sterling hadn't fully explored yet. Most people don't understand that when you own a house through a complex web of corporate entities, you aren't just a landlord, you are a sovereign state with your own set of laws. And Preston, in his desperate greed to be the king of a castle he didn't build, had walked straight into a legal minefield. I spent the first hour of the morning tracing the signatures on the fraudulent quitclaim deed again, my eyes narrowing as I saw the specific way my mother had coached him to mimic the loop of my G and the sharp slant of my T. It was a betrayal that tasted like copper in my mouth, a reminder that the woman who had birthed me had also studied me like a predator studies its prey, waiting for the exact moment of vulnerability to strike. I picked up my phone and saw a notification from the bank. Preston had tried to access the emergency line of credit again, this time from a different branch in a wealthier part of town, likely trying to use his charming persona to bypass the security freeze I had placed. I didn't feel anger. I felt a clinical sense of satisfaction as I watched the system flag his attempt as a potential identity theft event. Before I walk you through the precise moment the county sheriff arrived at the motel where they were hiding, I want to ask you a question that has been haunting me since the rain started. Have you ever realized that the person you were willing to die for was the same person who was holding the knife? Let me know in the comments where you are listening from, because I need to know if this kind of heartbreak is universal or if it's just the tax I pay for my success. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number, and I knew instinctively it was the new lawyer Preston had claimed to hire with the money he'd stolen from our father's 401k. I answered with a voice that was as sharp as a diamond-tipped drill. "This is Gemma Turner," I said, and the silence on the other end told me that the man was already out of his depth. He started rambling about family equity and implied trusts, trying to use legal jargon that he had likely looked up on a cheap website an hour before. I let him speak for exactly 3 minutes, my internal stopwatch ticking, before I interrupted him with a list of facts that silenced him instantly. "Listen carefully," I told him, "because I am only going to say this once. The property located at 4122 Oak Ridge is owned by an LLC of which I am the sole managing member. The deed your client filed is a forgery. The notary is a co-conspirator who is currently being reported to the Secretary of State. And the structural damage your client caused to the load-bearing columns has resulted in a county-mandated evacuation. You aren't representing a homeowner. You are representing a man who has committed felony mortgage fraud, identity theft, and reckless endangerment. If you call this number again without a formal summons, I will add a harassment charge to the pile." I hung up and felt a surge of adrenaline that was cleaner than any coffee could ever provide. I was no longer playing the role of the hurt daughter. I was the auditor-in-chief, and the audit was failing every single member of the Turner family. I spent the next few hours coordinating with the structural engineers I had hired to assess the damage Preston had caused. They sent me photos of the basement. The beautiful, hand-hewn support beams I had paid $20,000 for were laying in splinters on the concrete floor, replaced by cheap, unrated jack posts that were already beginning to bow under the weight of the second floor. It was a physical manifestation of Preston's entire life, removing something of substance and replacing it with a fragile, shiny imitation. I felt a pang of grief for the house, not because of its value, but because of what it represented, the sanctuary I had tried to build for a family that didn't know how to be safe. I remembered the Sunday dinners we had held there just a month ago, the smell of my mother's pot roast filling the air, and the way I had felt so proud to see my father sitting in his leather recliner. I realized now that they hadn't been enjoying my success. They had been scouting the territory they planned to annex. The matriarch's grace I had extended to them was a currency they had spent until the account was empty, and now they were surprised that the credit had run out. At noon, I received a text from Sterling with a copy of the emergency injunction we were filing. We weren't just asking for the house back. We were asking for a freeze on all assets Preston had touched, including the accounts he had manipulated our parents into co-signing. I was going to strip him of every dime, every designer suit, and every ounce of the unearned status he had used to buy his fiancée's affection. I thought about Kiara, the woman he was set to marry, and I wondered if she knew she was hitching her wagon to a falling star. Probably not. She was likely as blinded by the golden boy facade as my parents were. I spent the afternoon in the hotel's business center, printing out the final notices of debt collection. I had successfully purchased the invoices from the plumber, the electrician, and the tile guy, which meant that I was now the primary creditor for all the improvements Preston had bragged about. I wasn't just his sister, I was his bank, and I was about to call in the loan. The irony was a bitter medicine that I swallowed with a glass of ice water. As the sun began to set over the Atlanta skyline, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. I saw a news alert on my phone about a structural emergency in the suburbs, and I knew the local media had picked up on the red tag at the villa. Preston's shame was going to be public. a spectacle of his own making. I imagined my mother's face when she saw the cameras, the way she would try to hide behind her pearls and her dignity, not realizing that her dignity had been sold the moment she watched my bags hit the mud. I felt a sudden sharp memory of my grandmother, a woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep her daughters in school, and I remembered her telling me that a house is only as strong as the truth told inside its walls. My family had been living in a house of lies for decades, and I had been the one paying the rent on their delusions. No more. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, the silence of the hotel room a stark contrast to the screaming wind of the storm that had started this whole ordeal. I thought about the words, strong black woman, and how they had been used as a leash to keep me from ever asking for what I needed. I had been strong enough to build them a kingdom, and now I was going to be strong enough to watch it burn. The audit was nearly complete, the liabilities were clear, and the only asset left on the board was my own peace of mind. I checked my phone one last time before heading to bed and saw a voicemail from my father. He wasn't yelling this time. He was whispering. "Gemma," he said, his voice cracking with a fear I had never heard before. "The motel is loud and your mother won't stop crying. Preston is gone. He said he had to meet a friend about a loan, but he hasn't come back and his phone is off. The police were here asking about the house again. Please, Gemma, I know we messed up. I know we shouldn't have signed that paper, but I'm your father. Don't leave us out here like this." I listened to the message twice, feeling the familiar pull of the old loyalty, the old grace, that wanted to pick up the phone and fix it. But then I looked at the photos of the ruined support beams in my basement. I looked at the trash bags in the mud, and I realized that if I saved them now, I would be signing my own death warrant. I deleted the message. Tomorrow, the sheriff would serve the papers at the motel. Tomorrow, the golden boy would have to answer for the fraud, and tomorrow, I would finally be free of the burden of being the only one who cared about the foundation. I was Gemma Turner, and I was finally home, even if home was a hotel room with a locked door and a silent phone. The silence wasn't a void, it was a fortress. I spent the final hours of the night reviewing the LLC's insurance policies, ensuring that the structural damage caused by unauthorized third-party work was fully documented to prevent any attempt by Preston to claim a payout. He had thought he was being clever by bypassing the permits, but all he had done was ensure that there was no financial safety net for his failures. I could see the path ahead clearly now. A long legal battle that would end with the house being restored to my name, the family dynamic permanently severed, and a new life where I was the only person who decided my worth. I thought about the tea my mother had been polishing her silver over, the way she had ignored my exile, and I realized that her silver would never be as bright as the truth I was now standing in. The storm outside had passed, but the clearing of the air revealed a landscape that had been permanently altered. I was 35, and I was finally starting my life. I had spent so long building for others that I had forgotten what it felt like to have a room of my own, a heart of my own, and a future that didn't involve repairing someone else's mistakes. I lay down on the bed, the silk sheets a cool relief against my tired skin, and I let the darkness of the room wrap around me like a shield. I wasn't the strong black woman tonight. I was just Gemma, and that was more than enough. The weight I had been carrying for 20 years was gone, replaced by the light, airy sensation of absolute autonomy. They had thought they were kicking me out of a house, but they were actually kicking me out of a prison. I breathed in the quiet, filtered air of the hotel, a scent of lilies and high-end laundry, and I felt a smile touch my lips for the first time since the rain began. The audit was closed, the balance was zero, and I was finally, irrevocably reigning. As I drifted towards sleep, I thought about the legal definition of grace. In some contexts, it means a period of time allowed for someone to fulfill an obligation. My family had been in their grace period for my entire life. They had failed to pay the debt of love, of respect, and of simple human decency. The period was over. The foreclosure on their entitlement had begun, and I was the one who would be conducting the auction of their remains. I felt no malice, only the deep soul-stirring satisfaction of a job well done. I had audited my life, and for the first time, I was the one with the surplus. I was the matriarch now, but my grace was a selective thing, reserved for those who knew how to honor the foundation. I slept, and for the first time in years. I didn't dream of crumbling walls or leaking roofs. I dreamt of a clear sky, a straight road, and the sound of my own footsteps walking toward a sun that didn't need me to hold it up. I woke up several times during the night, not from anxiety, but from the sheer novelty of the silence. In my old life, even in sleep, I was listening for the sound of a family member's crisis. I was listening for the hum of the HVAC system I had to maintain, the creak of the floorboards I had to fix, or the chime of a phone call from a brother who needed bail, or a mother who needed an ego boost. Now there was nothing but the quiet hum of the hotel's climate control. It was the sound of my own peace. I realized that for years I had mistaken being needed for being loved. Preston needed me to be his safety net. My parents needed me to be their retirement plan, but no one had ever just needed me to be Gemma. By walking away, I was giving them the opportunity to see what life was like without the person they had so casually discarded. I wasn't doing it to be mean. I was doing it to be honest. If I was as worthless and selfish as they had screamed during the storm, then my absence shouldn't be a problem for them. They should be thriving in their new, Preston-led paradise. The fact that they were already crumbling only proved that they had known my value all along. They just didn't want to pay the price for it. The price was respect, and it was a price they found too high to pay. I spent the early morning hours of Friday looking at the final documents Sterling had sent over, the ones that would officially trigger the eviction of Preston from the ownership he thought he had secured. It was a surgical strike, time to land just as he was trying to host his first investor meeting at a local restaurant. He was trying to pivot his stolen house into a new business venture, selling the dream of a life he hadn't earned. I watched through the digital lens of my phone as the process servers moved in. It was a clean, quiet moment. No shouting, no drama, just the delivery of a reality that could no longer be ignored. I felt a sense of completion, a finality that settled into my marrow. The story of the Turner family was ending, and the story of Gemma was beginning. I was the architect, the auditor, and finally, the owner of my own destiny. The house in the suburbs would eventually be sold. The money moved into a trust they couldn't touch, and the memories of the rain would fade into the background of a much larger, much more beautiful life. I was 35, and the world was finally open. I had spent 15 years being a foundation, and now I was going to be the spire. I was going to be the thing that reached for the light, not the thing that sat in the mud. The matriarch's grace had finally turned inward, and in that self-love, I found a power that no forgery could ever steal. I was whole. I was free. I was Gemma. My brother kicked me out in a storm, and by Friday morning, the clouds had cleared to reveal a legal landscape that was scorched earth for him and a fresh green pasture for me. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of my hotel suite, the charcoal gray silk of my robe feeling like a second skin as I watched the sunrise ignite the glass towers of downtown Atlanta. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a life-altering betrayal, a quiet so profound that you can finally hear the gears of your own mind turning without the constant static of other people's needs. I took a sip of my black coffee, the bitterness a grounding force, and I thought about the word heritage. I had named my LLC GT Heritage Holdings, not because I wanted to preserve the past, but because I wanted to control the future of the Turner name. I was the one who had clawed our way out of the cycle of debt that had plagued my grandparents and parents, yet in their eyes, I was merely the bank that never closed. Before I dive into the financial massacre I orchestrated that morning, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the person who built the house only to be told you don't belong at the table? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, because the story of the strong black woman being discarded is a song sang in every corner of the world. I sat down at my laptop and opened the encrypted folder that contained the lifeblood of my operation. Friday was the day I stopped being a victim and started being a creditor. I had spent the previous night executing a series of buyouts that would make a venture capitalist blush. I had contacted every single subcontractor Preston had tried to bully or cheat. I didn't just pay them, I bought their frustration. I bought their right to sue. I bought their mechanics liens. By 9:00 a.m., my LLC was the primary lien holder on the property at 4122 Oak Ridge. Preston thought he was the owner, but in reality, he was now living in a house owned by a company that he owed $84,000 to in immediate construction debts. I pulled up the latest bank statement for the family emergency fund I had set up for my parents years ago. I saw that my mother had attempted to withdraw $5,000 at a branch in Decatur just 20 minutes prior. The transaction had been declined. I could almost see her face, the shock, the indignation, the way she would tell the teller that there must be some mistake because her successful daughter always kept that account full. She didn't realize that I had officially severed the link between my corporate earnings and their lifestyle. I wasn't just closing the tap, I was removing the pipes. My phone began to vibrate, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the panic I knew was setting in at the motel. It was my mother. I let it ring for exactly 5 cycles before I answered, my voice a calm, professional monotone that offered no room for emotional manipulation. "Gemma!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I am at the bank and they are telling me my card is blocked. They said something about a fraud alert. I have your father here, and he needs his medication. And Preston says the motel is demanding another night's payment in advance, or they'll lock us out. What is going on with you? Why are you being so spiteful?" I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my tablet, seeing a woman, something about a fraud alert. I have your father here, and he needs his medication. And Preston says the motel is demanding another night's payment in advance, or they'll lock us out. What is going on with you? Why are you being so spiteful? I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my tablet, seeing a woman who was no longer moved by the sound of her mother's tears. "Mom," I said, my voice steady as a heartbeat. "The fraud alert is there because there has been fraud. Preston used a forged deed to steal a corporate asset. Since he is an authorized user on some of those accounts, the bank has frozen everything until the criminal investigation is complete." "I can't fix a legal freeze, Mom. That's out of my hands." "Spiteful?" I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air like a heavy curtain. "Spite is throwing your daughter's clothes into a storm. This is just an audit, and an audit always finds the truth. You need to talk to Preston. He's the one who claimed he could take care of the family. He's the one who wanted the house. Surely he has a plan for your medication and the motel bill." "But Gemma," she sobbed. And I could hear the sound of my father coughing in the background, a sound she always used to trigger my fixer instinct. "We don't have anything. Preston says he's waiting for a wire transfer from an investor, but it hasn't come yet. We are sitting in a room with 2 beds and a broken air conditioner. Your father's heart can't take this. How can you sit in that fancy hotel while we suffer?" I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of 35 years of being the safety net, trying to pull me back down. I thought about the master suite in the villa, the one with the heated floors and the steam shower I had installed specifically for my father's joints. I thought about how they had moved into it before I even had the chance to spend a night there. I thought about how they had watched Preston throw my life into the mud. "Mom," I said, and for the first time I felt a sense of profound pity for her. "You aren't suffering because of me. You are suffering because you chose a lie over your daughter. You chose the golden boy's fantasy over the reality I built for you. If you want to leave that motel, I have a solution. I have instructed my attorney to prepare a housing agreement for you and Dad. It's a clean, safe apartment in a good neighborhood. The rent and utilities will be paid by the LLC, but there is a condition, a non-negotiable one. Preston is not allowed to set foot on the property. He is not allowed to live with you, and he is not allowed to use a single cent of the allowance the LLC will provide for your care. If he so much as knocks on the door, the lease is terminated." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. "You're trying to separate us?" she whispered, horrified. "You're trying to break up the family?" "No, Mom," I replied. "I'm trying to save the people who are worth saving. Preston is a fire, and if you keep standing next to him, you're going to get burned. I'm giving you a bucket of water. It's up to you if you want to use it." I hung up the phone before she could respond, knowing that she wouldn't sign it, not yet. She still believed in the miracle. She still believed that Preston would find a way to make the numbers work, not realizing that I was the only one who had ever made the numbers work. I spent the rest of the morning at my law firm, sitting in a glass-walled conference room with Sterling. He looked at me with a mixture of respect and professional curiosity. "You're really doing it, Gemma," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "These are the formal notices of debt acceleration. Since the LLC now owns the subcontractor debts, and since Preston has defaulted on the implied contract of his occupancy by committing fraud, we are demanding full payment of the $84,000 within 48 hours, or we proceed with a sheriff's sale of his interest in the property." Sterling paused, his eyes searching mine. "You know he has no interest. The deed is a forgery. Why the sheriff's sale?" "Because," I said, leaning forward, "I want him to try to defend it in court. I want him to stand in front of a judge and explain where he got the $10 he supposedly paid for a $2 million villa. I want him to explain why he removed load-bearing columns without a permit. I want him to perjure himself. I want the system to see him exactly as he is, and I want the public record to show that the golden boy is a thief." Sterling nodded, a slow, appreciative gesture. "And the parents?" "They're in a motel near the airport," I said, feeling a momentary flash of the old pain before I pushed it back. "They're waiting for a wire transfer that doesn't exist. They'll hold out for another 24 hours, and then the reality of the heat and the hunger will set in. When they call back, I want the apartment papers ready." I left the firm and drove back toward the suburbs, but I didn't go to the house. I went to a small, quiet park a few blocks away, the same park where I used to take Preston when we were kids, back when I thought it was my job to protect him from the world. I sat on a bench and watched a young mother playing with her children, and I realized that the cycle of the strong black woman starts so early. We are taught to be the keepers of the peace, the ones who absorb the blows so the rest of the family can stay soft. We are taught that our strength is our only value. But what happens when the people you're protecting start using your strength against you? What happens when they mistake your grace for a weakness they can exploit? I thought about the red mud on my silk blouse, and I realized that the storm hadn't been an ending. It had been an initiation. I was 35 years old, and I was finally learning how to be the protagonist of my own life. I took out my phone and checked the security feed of the house. The orange-red tag was still there, glowing like a brand on the front door. I saw a black sedan pull into the driveway. It was the building inspector returning with a structural engineer. They spent an hour walking the perimeter, taking measurements and shaking their heads. I knew what they were seeing. A house that was technically totaled in its current state. The cost to repair the structural damage Preston had caused, combined with the fines for the unpermitted work, would exceed the equity he thought he was stealing. He hadn't just stolen a house. He had stolen a liability. He had stolen a debt. I felt a cold, sharp sense of justice. He wanted the crown, but he didn't realize the crown was made of thorns. At 5:00 p.m., my phone buzzed again. It wasn't my mother this time. It was Preston. I hesitated, then I answered. I wanted to hear the sound of his defeat. "Gemma, you bitch!" he screamed, his voice raw and ragged. "I know what you did. The bank said the accounts are under investigation. The contractors are calling me saying they sold their invoices to you. You're trying to ruin me. This was my chance to be a man, to show Mom and Dad that I could do what you do, and you're sabotaging it because you're jealous. You've always been jealous of me because they loved me more. You've always tried to buy their love with your money. But it didn't work, did it? Even with the house, they still chose me. I listened to him, his words like small, blunt stones hitting a wall. I didn't feel hurt. I felt a strange, detached curiosity. "Preston," I said, my voice so quiet he had to stop screaming to hear me. "I'm not sabotaging you, I'm auditing you. There's a difference. Sabotage is something you do to an enemy. Auditing is something you do to a fraud. You think I'm jealous of you? You're sitting in a cheap motel with no money, no power, and a criminal investigation hanging over your head for a house you ruined in 48 hours. What exactly is there to be jealous of? The fact that Mom and Dad chose you isn't a victory, Preston. It's a tragedy. They chose a mirage over the person who actually kept them alive. They chose the son who steals over the daughter who builds, and now they're learning the price of that choice. You have 48 hours to pay the $84,000 you owe GT Heritage Holdings. If you don't, I will see you in court on Monday morning. And Preston," I added, my voice hardening, "don't call me again. From now on, you speak to Sterling." I hung up and felt a wave of peace so absolute it was almost frightening. The strong black woman was dead. Long live the auditor. I drove back to the hotel, the city lights beginning to twinkle like a million tiny stars, each one a possibility I had never allowed myself to imagine. I was 35, I was wealthy, I was brilliant, and for the first time in my life, I was completely alone. And I loved it. I spent the evening in the hotel's spa, letting the heat of the sauna and the pressure of the massage wash away the last remnants of the Turner family's entitlement. I thought about the house one more time, not as a home, but as a lesson. It was a beautiful structure, but it was built on a foundation of transactional love and unearned privilege. It had to fall so I could build something real. As I lay in bed that night, the silence of the room was a symphony. I realized that the matriarch's grace wasn't about saving people who didn't want to be saved. It was about having the grace to let them face the consequences of their own actions. It was about the grace to walk away. I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The ledger of my life finally balanced. The storm was over, the audit was complete, and for the first time, the numbers were in my favor. I was Gemma Turner, and I was finally reigning in a kingdom of my own making. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, my mind already moving to the final stage of the plan. I knew that by Monday, the motel would be a memory. The villa would be a legal battlefield, and my parents would have to make the hardest decision of their lives. I hoped they would choose the apartment. I hoped they would choose the bucket of water. But even if they didn't, even if they chose to burn with their golden boy, I knew I would be okay. I had already built my own fortress, and the walls were made of a truth that no one could forge. I spent the morning reviewing the criminal complaint for identity theft and forgery. I had the security footage from the county office showing Preston and my mother walking in together to file the deed. I had the testimony of the notary who had admitted to Sterling that she had been pressured into stamping the document without my presence. The evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't just a civil matter. It was a felony. I felt a momentary pang for my mother. She could be charged as an accessory. But then I remembered the way she had polished that silver spoon while I was standing in the rain. I remembered that she had known exactly what she was doing. She had gambled my life for Preston's ego, and she had lost. At noon, I received a final text from my father. "Gemma, we're at the apartment. Mom signed the paper. Preston is screaming in the parking lot, but we're inside. The key worked. Thank you, daughter." I read the message twice, feeling a single warm tear track down my cheek. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The transaction was complete. I had provided the safety net one last time, but this time it had a lock on the door. I looked out at the Atlanta skyline, feeling the sun on my face, and I realized that the strong black woman trope was finally broken. I didn't have to hold the world up anymore. I just had to hold myself. And for the first time in 35 years, that was enough. I was Gemma Turner, the managing member of my own soul, and the audit was closed. The story of the Turner family was a tragedy of greed, but the story of Gemma was a masterpiece of grace, the kind of grace that knows when to say no. I walked out onto the balcony, the air crisp and clean, and I breathed in the future. It was quiet. It was beautiful. And it was mine. My brother kicked me out in a storm, but the invitation he sent 3 days later was as dry as a desert bone and twice as hollow as his promises. The cream-colored envelope was hand-delivered to my hotel by a courier who looked far too expensive for someone living in a motel near the airport, which told me immediately that Preston was still hemorrhaging money. He didn't have to maintain an image that was already dead. I sat on the edge of the plush king-sized bed, my fingers tracing the embossed gold lettering that read, "The Turner Legacy Celebration and Engagement Gala for Preston and Kiara." It was scheduled for Saturday night at a high-end ballroom in Midtown, because as the courier had likely been told, the family villa was currently undergoing exclusive private renovations. He hadn't just lied to me and the banks, he was lying to the entire world. And he expected me to play the part of the silent, supportive sister who would bankroll his grand illusion from the shadows of a hotel suite. I opened my laptop and felt the familiar cold hum of the GT Heritage Holdings database, a world of spreadsheets and legal filings that held more truth than any family dinner ever could. Before I explain the trap I set during that gala, I want to ask you a question that has been weighing on my soul since I saw the gold ink on that card. Have you ever been invited to celebrate a person who has spent their entire life trying to bury you? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because the audacity of a golden child is a universal language of pain. I spent the morning with Sterling in his glass-walled office, the city of Atlanta stretching out behind him like a map of my own ambition. "We have the forensic report on the signature Gemma," he said, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany table. "It's a match for your mother's handwriting style when she's trying to be formal, but the pressure points are all Preston." They sat together at that kitchen table and practiced how to steal your life while you were at work earning the money to pay their property taxes. I looked at the graphs of the pen strokes, the peaks and valleys of a betrayal that had been rehearsed, like a play. The notary has already flipped. She's terrified of losing her commission and facing prison time, so she's signed a sworn statement saying Preston told her you were in the hospital and had given him power of attorney. He's digging a hole so deep he'll never see the sun again, Gemma. I stood up and walked to the window, feeling the heat of the Georgia sun through the glass, a sharp contrast to the ice in my veins. It's not enough to just arrest him. "Sterling!" I said, my voice a low vibration of suppressed power. "If we do it now, he'll play the victim. He'll tell our parents and the church and the neighbors that I'm the cold corporate monster who put her own brother in jail over a misunderstanding. I want him to stand in that ballroom in front of everyone he's trying to impress, and I want the floor to fall out from under him. I want the world to see the audit in real time." Sterling leaned back, his eyes narrowing with a professional respect that bordered on awe. "You're going to the party, aren't you?" "I'm going to the party," I replied, "and I'm bringing the ledger." I spent the afternoon at a boutique on Phipps Plaza, choosing a dress that didn't look like an olive branch, but a declaration of war. It was a deep midnight blue silk, structured and sharp, with a neckline that commanded respect and a silhouette that reminded the world I was 35 and in the prime of my power. As the tailor pinned the hem, I thought about the strong black woman expectation again, the way our community expects us to absorb the blows of our men and our elders, with a smile and a prayer. My mother had raised me to be a pillar, but she had forgotten that a pillar is only valuable as long as it holds up the roof. If the roof tries to crush the pillar must either break or stand alone. I was standing alone, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel lonely. My phone buzzed with a call from my mother, but I didn't answer it. I knew she wanted money for a dress or a hair appointment or a new set of pearls to hide the shame of the motel room. I had already authorized the LLC to pay for her and my father's basic needs, but the luxury line had been severed. I was giving them the grace of a roof and a bed, but I was no longer giving them the grace of my silence. Friday night was a fever dream of preparation. I coordinated with the building inspector, the sheriff's office, and the private security team I had hired to secure the villa. The house was now fully braced with steel supports, but it was still unlivable, a dark monument to Preston's incompetence. I reviewed the final documents for the debt acceleration and the foreclosure notice on the fictitious interest he had created. By the time I closed my eyes that night, the ledger was balanced and the trap was set. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind of air that precedes a hurricane. I spent the day in a state of quiet grace, my movements slow and deliberate as I prepared for the evening. I did my own makeup, focusing on the sharp lines of my eyes and the deep mahogany of my lips. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the woman who had been kicked out in a storm. I saw the matriarch of a new legacy, one built on truth and merit, instead of blood and lies. I arrived at the ballroom at exactly 8 o'clock, the valets scurrying to open the door of my Mercedes. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a grotesque parody of the elegance I had tried to bring to our family home. I saw Preston in the center of the room wearing a tuxedo that likely cost more than my father's truck. His arm draped around Kiara, who was glowing in a cloud of white tulle. They looked like royalty, and for a moment the crowd of family, friends, and local business owners seemed to believe the lie. Then Preston saw me. The color drained from his face for a split second, a flash of pure animal terror, before he masked it with a sneer of triumph. "Gemma!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the room as he moved toward me. "I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show up after the way you've been acting. Did you come to apologize?" I stood my ground, my posture a masterclass in restrained power as the room fell silent. "I didn't come to apologize, Preston," I said, my voice clear and cold, cutting through the music like a blade. "I came to provide the final audit." I saw my mother and father standing near the buffet, their faces a map of confusion and dawning dread. They looked at my dress, they looked at my eyes, and they saw a woman they no longer recognized. Preston laughed, a forced, jagged sound that didn't reach his eyes. Always the auditor, always the businesswoman. Can't you just for one night be a sister? Can't you just celebrate that the family is back on top? I looked at him. Then I looked at the crowd, and I felt the weight of every silent sacrifice I had ever made. "The family isn't on top, Preston," I said loud enough for the guests in the front row to hear. "The family is in a motel because you forged a deed to a house you couldn't even keep standing. The family is under a criminal investigation because you thought my life was something you could just sign over to yourself for $10. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small, sleek tablet, its screen glowing with the documents Sterling and I had spent the week perfecting. I saw the security guards I had hired moving into position at the doors, their presence a quiet promise of order. "This isn't a celebration of a legacy." "Preston," I said, stepping closer to him as Kiara began to shrink away. "This is the foreclosure of a fraud." At that moment, the double doors at the back of the hall opened and the sheriff walked in, followed by the building inspector. The room erupted in a low murmur of shock, and my mother let out a small, choked sob. Preston tried to run his tuxedo jacket flapping like the wings of a trapped bird, but the guards were already there. He turned back to me, his face contorted in a mask of rage and entitlement. "You ruined it," he screamed. "You had everything and you couldn't just let me have this one thing. You've always been the favorite because you have the money. But they love me, Gemma. They'll always love me more than you." I looked at him and I felt a profound sense of peace. "I know they do, Preston," I whispered so only he could hear. "And that's exactly why you're going to lose everything. Because love without respect is just a debt that never gets paid." I watched as the sheriff stepped forward and began to read him his rights, the words forgery and mortgage fraud echoing through the crystal chandeliers of the ballroom. I saw my father bow his head, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a reality he could no longer ignore. I saw my mother reach out for the silver spoon in her purse, a habit of comfort that had no power here. I stood in the center of the storm. I had created a woman of 35 who had finally walked out of the rain and into the light. The audit was over, the ledger was closed, and the matriarch's grace had finally found its true home in the quiet strength of a woman who knew her own worth. I didn't stay for the arrest. I turned and walked out of the ballroom, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythmic, confident sound. As I stepped out into the cool night air of Atlanta, I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. I was Gemma Turner. I was the managing member of my own life, and for the first time, I was truly free. The house in the suburbs was a ruin. The family was a tragedy, but the woman walking toward her car was a masterpiece of her own making. The storm had done its work, and the clearing was beautiful. I drove away from the noise and the lights toward the quiet of a future where I didn't have to be the foundation for anyone but myself. I thought about the house one last time, not the villa, but the house I would build next. It would have a foundation of truth, walls of respect, and a roof of peace. And the only person with the key would be me. I arrived back at the hotel and went up to my room, the silence now a welcoming friend. I sat on the balcony and watched the city lights, realizing that the true heritage I had protected wasn't a name or a property, but the integrity of my own soul. The audit had been long, it had been painful, but the surplus was infinite. I was 35, and the rest of my life was waiting. I was whole, I was powerful, and I was finally home. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool night air, feeling the silk of my dress against my skin, a reminder that I was the author of my own story. The matriarch's grace was no longer a burden, it was a crown, and I was finally ready to wear it. I spent the next few hours in a state of deep reflection, thinking about the journey from that rainy Tuesday to this triumphant Saturday. I realized that the hardest part wasn't the legal battle or the financial restructuring, but the emotional detachment from a family that had been my entire world. I had been their servant, their savior, and their scapegoat. Now I was simply their creditor, and the clarity of that role was a gift. I thought about my mother and father, and I hoped that in the quiet of their new apartment, they would finally find the courage to see the truth. But I knew I couldn't force them to see it. I could only provide the space for them to look. I thought about Preston, and I felt a flicker of sadness for the man he could have been if he hadn't been shielded from every consequence. But he had chosen his path, and now he would have to walk it alone. I was no longer the one who would pick him up when he fell. I was the one who had finally allowed him to hit the ground. I stood up and went inside, closing the balcony door on the sounds of the city. I was tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after a long day of honest work. I undressed and got into bed, the high thread count sheets a luxury I no longer felt guilty for enjoying. I had earned every inch of this bed, every cent of my bank account, and every ounce of my peace. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that the story of Gemma Turner wasn't a story of revenge. It was a story of reclamation. I had reclaimed my time, my money, and my soul, and that was the greatest grace of all. The ledger was balanced, the audit was finished, and the report was final. I was free. I was powerful. I was me. The next morning, I would wake up and start the process of selling the villa and setting up the trusts for my parents. But for now, I just wanted to sleep. I wanted to dream of a world where I was enough, just as I was, without the suits, the titles, or the checkbook. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that world was already here. I was Gemma, and I was finally home. The quiet of the hotel room was a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the past could no longer reach me. I breathed into the darkness, feeling the strength of my own heartbeat, a steady rhythm of survival and success. I had survived the storm, I had survived the betrayal, and I had survived the strong black woman trap. I was a new kind of strong. Now, a strength that didn't require me to carry anyone else. I was a strength that was built for one, and as I slept, I smiled because I knew that tomorrow the sun would rise on a world that finally belonged to me. The end of the audit was the beginning of my life. I had spent 35 years as a supporting character in someone else's drama, but now the camera was on me, and I was ready for my close-up. I was Gemma Turner, and I was reigning. The storm had passed, and the air was clear. I was whole. I was free. I was home. The final count of my life was a surplus of joy. I had done the work, I had paid the price, and now I was going to enjoy the profit. The matriarch's grace was mine and mine alone, and it was beautiful. I slept deeply and without interruption, a peace that was the ultimate reward for a woman who had finally learned to put herself first. The journey had been long, but the destination was worth every step. I was home. I was whole. I was me. The ledger is closed and the balance is perfect. I am Gemma and I am finally free. The fluorescent lights of the Fulton County precinct hummed with a clinical, persistent vibration that seemed to drill directly into the exposed nerves of my family's shattered dignity. And as I sat on the hard plastic chair in the waiting area at 3 a.m. on Sunday, I realized that the matriarch's grace was no longer a shield I carried for them, but a mirror I was holding up to their own decay. The aftermath of the gala arrest had been a whirlwind of sirens, flashing lights, and the hushed, scandalized whispers of Atlanta's elite. But here, in the cold quiet of the police station, the adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind the sour taste of reality. Preston was behind bars in a holding cell, his tuxedo now a ridiculous costume of failed ambition. And my parents were slumped on a nearby bench, looking like two people who had just watched their entire world get sucked into a sinkhole. My mother Barbara was still wearing her silk gala dress, but the fabric was wrinkled and stained with the tears of a woman who still couldn't understand why her golden boy was being treated like a common criminal. While my father Richard stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, his silence no longer a tool of avoidance, but a heavy, suffocating weight. Before I described the moment, the lead detective handed me the folder containing the full extent of Preston's secondary identity theft operations. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had to stand in a room full of people who blame you for the consequences of their own choices? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because the moment a family's mask finally slips is a moment that echoes across every culture and every coastline. I watched the clock on the wall, its red digital numbers ticking toward 4 a.m., and I felt a strange sense of detachment as if I were auditing a company that had already filed for bankruptcy. The detective, a weary woman named Miller, with eyes that had seen every version of human greed, walked toward me with a thick manila envelope and motioned for me to follow her into a private office. She didn't look at my parents. She looked at me with a professional respect that told me she knew exactly who had provided the paper trail. "Miss Turner, we've just finished the initial scrub of your brother's personal laptop and the burner phones we recovered from the rental SUV," she said, dropping the envelope onto the metal desk with a heavy thud. "It's worse than the mortgage fraud. He wasn't just trying to steal the house from your LLC. He was using your parents' social security numbers and your professional credentials to open a series of shell accounts in offshore banks. He's been moving small increments of money, about $40,000 in total, over the last 6 months. He was preparing to drain the final equity from your parents' retirement fund the moment the deed transfer was finalized." I felt a cold, sharp chill settle into my marrow, not because of the money, but because of the calculated nature of the betrayal. He hadn't just made a mistake in a moment of desperation. He had been systematically harvesting our family's future to fund his own escape. Did they know? I asked, my voice a low, hollow rasp. Detective Miller sighed, leaning back in her chair. "From the messages we've recovered, it looks like your parents gave him their information because he told them it was for a family trust you were setting up. They trusted him, Gemma. They trusted him to handle the details so they wouldn't have to bother you with the boring stuff. He played on their desire to feel useful and their need to believe he was finally becoming the man you already were. I walked back out into the waiting area and stood in front of my mother. She looked up, her eyes searching mine for the old Gemma, the one who would pull out her checkbook and make the problem go away with a few phone calls and a lecture on family loyalty. "Gemma, you have to get him out of there," she whispered, reaching for my hand with fingers that felt like cold parchment. "He's terrified. He says the police are making things up because you told them to. He says if you just sign a statement saying the deed was a gift, they'll let him go. Please, daughter, for the sake of our name." I looked at her and I saw the silver spoon she was still clutching in her handbag, a useless relic of a status she never actually earned. "Mom, the names on the documents aren't just mine," I said, my voice devoid of the warmth she was begging for. "He used your social security number to open accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was planning to leave you and Dad with nothing the moment he got the keys to the villa. He didn't love you more than me, Mom. He just found it easier to rob you because you were so busy looking for reasons to doubt me." My mother's face went slack, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She looked at my father, who finally looked up, his eyes wet with a shame that was 20 years too late. "Richard, tell her he didn't do that," Barbara stammered, turning to her husband. "Tell her our Preston wouldn't steal from us." My father didn't speak. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a credit card statement I hadn't seen yet. "I found this in his room at the motel last night," he said, his voice shaking. $2,000 at a jewelry store for a ring for Kiara. He told me it was a gift from you, Gemma. He said you were so happy about the engagement that you wanted to pay for the ring." I sat down on the hard plastic chair, feeling the final thread of the old family bond snap. The matriarch's grace had been a bridge I built over a river of lies, and now the bridge was gone. "You see, Mom," I said softly, "there is no family name to protect anymore. There is only the audit. And the audit is failing." I spent the next 3 hours coordinating with the bank's fraud department and the insurance adjusters, ensuring that every unauthorized account was flagged and every cent was tracked. I didn't do it for the money. I did it for the integrity of the ledger. By the time the sun began to rise over the gray rooftops of Atlanta, I had officially filed the paperwork to dissolve any remaining financial ties between myself and my parents. They would have the apartment I provided and the basic allowance, but the open-ended support was over. I was no longer a provider. I was a benefactor with a strict set of conditions. I walked out of the precinct into the cool morning air, leaving my parents to wait for the lawyer they couldn't afford, and the son who had already abandoned them in his heart. As I drove toward the hotel, I saw a news truck heading toward the villa, and I knew the story was about to break. The Turner family scandal would be the gossip of the city by noon. I didn't care. I felt a sense of lightness that was almost euphoric. I was 35, and I was finally debt-free, not of money, but of the emotional mortgage I had been paying on a family that never wanted me to be anything but a safety net. I arrived back at the hotel and went straight to the business center to print out the notice of demolition for the house. The structural engineers had confirmed that the damage was terminal. The villa had to come down. It was a poetic justice I hadn't expected. The physical manifestation of the family's greed was literally unable to support its own weight. I went up to my room and stood on the balcony watching the city wake up, and I realized that the real heritage I was leaving behind wasn't a building or a bank account. It was the truth. I was Gemma Turner, and I was the only person who could define my worth. The audit of my 35 years was complete, and for the first time the surplus was entirely mine. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the morning air, realizing that the storm hadn't just moved my things. It had moved my soul. I was home. My brother kicked me out in a storm, but the steel bars of the Fulton County Jail were far colder than any rain that had ever fallen on the red clay of Georgia. And as I sat in the visiting booth on Monday afternoon, I realized that the glass between us was the only thing keeping the rot of his desperation from staining my silk blouse. Preston looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit, his skin a sickly gray under the flickering industrial lights, and his hands, which had never known a day of hard labor, were shaking as he reached for the plastic telephone receiver. I didn't pick up mine immediately. I watched him with the clinical gaze of an auditor who has found the missing millions and knows exactly which head is going to roll. I saw the way he looked at my gold watch and the sharp lines of my designer blazer. He was still calculating, still trying to find a way to leverage our shared blood into a bail bond. He had no idea that I wasn't there to save him. I was there to close the file. Before I tell you the devastating secret I discovered about his fiancée, Kiara, and the money she stole from our parents' medicine cabinet, let me know where you are watching from today, because the betrayal of a golden child is a story that repeats itself in every language and every heart. I finally lifted the receiver, the plastic cold against my ear. "Gemma, you have to help me," he hissed his voice, a jagged rasp of panic and unearned entitlement. "The lawyers, they're saying the LLC is pushing for maximum sentencing. They're calling it predatory fraud. You can stop this. Just tell them you gave me permission to sign the deed. Tell them it was a private family arrangement and you changed your mind. If I go to prison, Mom will die of a broken heart and you know it. You'll be the one who killed the family, Gemma. Is that what you want?" I looked at him and I felt a strange sense of hollowness where my anger used to live. I thought about the strong black woman label that our mother had used like a harness to keep me pulling the plow of their lives for 15 years. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent in fluorescent-lit offices while Preston was at clubs and my parents were at brunch, all of it funded by the silence of my sacrifice. "No, Preston?" I said, my voice, a low, calm vibration that made him flinch. "I won't be the one who killed the family. You killed the family the moment you decided that my life was your playground. You didn't just steal a house. You tried to steal my identity. You used my professional credentials to funnel money into accounts for Kiara, money she took and vanished with the second the police arrived at the gala. Did you know she's in Miami, Preston? She didn't stay for the bail hearing. She didn't even stay to pack your clothes. She took the leased SUV and the engagement ring you bought with Dad's retirement fund, and she's gone." Preston's face went from desperation to a blank mask of shock, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. "No," he whispered. "She loves me. We're getting married. We were going to run the heritage from the villa." I leaned in closer to the glass, feeling the coldness of the truth radiating from my bones. "There is no heritage, Preston. There is only GT Heritage Holdings, which I own, and which is currently suing you for the total cost of the villa's demolition. The house is being torn down on Wednesday. Every brick, every quartz countertop, every memory I tried to build for people who didn't respect me is going to be ground into dust. And the bill for that dust is going to be tied to your name for the rest of your life. I'm not here to bail you out. I'm here to tell you that I've officially removed myself as your sister in every legal and financial sense of the word. From this moment on, you are just a debtor to my corporation." I hung up the phone before he could scream, before he could beg, before he could use the word family as a weapon one last time. I walked out of the jail and into the humid afternoon air of Atlanta, feeling the weight of the world lifting from my shoulders with every step. I drove to the small apartment I had rented from my parents, a modest one-bedroom near the park that was a far cry from the luxury they had tried to steal. When I walked in, the air smelled of stale tea, and my mother's expensive perfume, a scent that now felt like a funeral shroud. My father was sitting at the small kitchen table staring at a pile of legal documents Sterling had sent over, the formal notices that their credit was ruined and their retirement was a shadow of what it had been. They looked at me as I entered, and for the first time in my 35 years, I saw them as people instead of parents. They were just two aging humans who had gambled their daughter's peace for a son's ego and lost. "Gemma." My mother started her voice trembling as she reached for the silver spoon she had managed to save from the villa. I didn't say a word. I just walked to the table and laid a single folder in front of them. "This is the last of it," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the grace they were used to. "The LLC has paid for this apartment for 1 year. I've set up a trust that will cover your basic medical and food costs, but it is managed by a third-party firm. I have no access to it, and you have no access to me. If you try to contact me to ask for money for Preston or to guilt me into helping him with his trial, the trust is dissolved. I am leaving Atlanta tonight." My mother looked at the folder, then at the silver spoon, then at me. "You're really leaving us? After everything we did for you? You wouldn't have that fancy job if we hadn't raised you to be strong, Gemma. You owe us your life." I looked at her and I realized that the debt they thought I owed was a bottomless pit that no amount of money or success could ever fill. "No, Mom," I said softly. "I don't owe you my life. I gave you 15 years of it and you threw it in the mud. I raised myself to be strong because I had to be, because you were too busy making sure Preston never had to be. You didn't raise a daughter, you raised a bank, and the bank is closed." I walked out of the apartment without looking back, leaving them in the silence of the life they had chosen. I drove toward the highway, the skyline of Atlanta fading in my rearview mirror as the sun began to set in a bruise of purple and gold. I thought about the villa and the demolition crew that would arrive in the morning, and I felt a sense of profound peace. The house had to fall so I could finally stand. I arrived at a quiet hotel near the coast, my mind already moving toward the future, toward the consulting firm I was building, and the life where I didn't have to be the foundation for anyone but myself. I checked my phone and saw a final message from Sterling. "The wrecking ball is on site. The site is cleared for the sale. You're free, Gemma." I sat on the balcony of my room listening to the sound of the ocean, and I realized that the matriarch's grace wasn't about forgiveness. It was about the sovereignty of the soul. It was about having the grace to walk away from a fire, even if the people you love are the ones who lit it. I was 35 years old, and for the first time I was truly home, because I was the only person with the key. The audit was finished, the ledger was balanced, and the profit was my own soul. I closed my eyes and breathed in the salt air, feeling the strength of my own heart, a steady rhythmic pulse that told me I was whole, I was free, and I was finally reigning in a kingdom of my own making. The storm had passed, and the clearing was more beautiful than anything I had ever imagined. I thought about the many women like me, women who are the pillars of their communities, the mothers, the grandmothers, the sisters who hold the line until their hands are blistered and their hearts are weary. I whispered a prayer for them that they too might find the strength to drop the weight that wasn't theirs to carry. I realized that my story wasn't just about a brother's betrayal or a house's collapse. It was about the moment a woman realizes her own worth and quietly, elegantly walks away. I spent the night in a state of deep, restorative sleep, dreaming of a world where love wasn't transactional and strength wasn't a prerequisite for being seen. When I woke up the next morning, the world was bright and the road was open. I was Gemma Turner, and I was no longer the unbreakable foundation. I was the architect, I was the auditor, and I was the one who survived. I checked the news one last time before leaving the hotel, a small blurb about the demolition of a luxury villa in the suburbs due to structural instability. It was a footnote in the city's history, but for me, it was the final period at the end of a very long sentence. I drove onto the highway, my hands steady on the wheel, my vision clear. I was moving toward Savannah, toward the river and the moss and the life I had earned with my own sweat and my own tears. I was moving toward a future where the only person I had to answer to was the woman in the mirror, and she was smiling. The matriarch's grace was now a crown, and I was finally ready to wear it. I thought about Preston one last time, not with anger, but with a quiet pity for the man who would spend his life trying to rebuild a house of cards. I thought about my parents, and I hoped they would find some measure of peace in the quiet of their new apartment. But I knew I couldn't carry their peace for them. I had my own to protect. I arrived in Savannah as the afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows over the cobblestones, and I knew I was where I belonged. I walked into my new office, the space smelling of fresh paint and possibility, and I sat at my desk. I opened a new ledger, and at the top of the first page, I wrote one name, Gemma. It was the only account that mattered now. I spent the afternoon reviewing the initial intake forms for my first 3 clients, all women who were looking to protect their assets from the families that viewed them as utilities. I was going to teach them how to build their own fortresses. I was going to teach them the power of the LLC, the power of the silent audit, and the power of the quiet exit. I was going to turn my pain into a blueprint for a new generation of sovereign women. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood on the balcony of my office and watched the river flow toward the sea. The water was ancient and relentless, and in its movement, I saw the reflection of my own journey. I had been a dam for far too long, holding back the chaos of my family's greed. Now I was the river. I was moving forward, and I was never going back. The audit was closed, the balance was perfect, and the surplus was infinite. I was Gemma. I was whole. I was free. I was home. The story of the matriarch's grace had finally reached its true conclusion, not in a courtroom or a jail cell, but in the quiet of a woman's soul, as she finally realizes she is the only one she ever needed to save. The ledger of the past was archived, and the new account was open for business. I breathed in the fresh morning air, and I knew that the storm had been the greatest gift I had ever received. It had cleared the way for the sun, and the sun was glorious. I was Gemma Turner, and I was reigning. The final word on the matter was not revenge, but sovereignty. I had reclaimed my time, my money, and my soul, and that was a profit that no brother could ever steal, and no parent could ever forge. I was Gemma, and I was finally enough. I looked at the silver ring on my finger, not the one Preston had stolen, but a simple gold band I had bought for myself to celebrate my CPA license. It was a circle that never broke, just like my spirit. I realized that the matriarch's grace wasn't a gift you give to others. It's a state of being you cultivate within yourself. It's the ability to see the world as it is, to act with precision, and to protect your peace at all costs. I had spent 35 years learning that lesson, and the tuition had been high, but the graduation was spectacular. I sat back in my chair and watched the stars begin to appear over the Savannah skyline. I thought about the villa one last time, and I smiled. It was just a house. I was the home, and I was finally occupied by the person I loved most, myself. The audit of my heart was complete, and for the first time the numbers were in my favor. I was the owner of my destiny, the managing member of my soul, and the sole beneficiary of my own grace. I was Gemma, and I was finally free. The night air was cool and filled with the scent of jasmine, a sweet contrast to the memory of the rain. I breathed it in, letting it fill my lungs and my spirit. I was no longer afraid of the dark because I knew how to light my own way. I was no longer afraid of the storm because I knew how to be the anchor. And I was no longer afraid of being alone because I knew I was in good company. I was Gemma, and that was more than enough. The end of the story was just the beginning of my life. And as I closed the ledger for the night, I knew that tomorrow the sun would rise on a world that finally belonged to me. I was ready. I was whole. I was me. The ledger is closed and the balance is perfect. I am Gemma, and I am finally free. The final words of my family's drama were a fading echo, but the first words of my new life were a vibrant symphony. I am Gemma, and I am home. I am Gemma, and I am sovereign. I am Gemma, and I am enough. The grace is mine. The peace is mine. The future is mine. The end. My brother kicked me out in a storm, but it was the silence of my new Savannah office that finally let me hear the sound of my own worth. And as I sat behind the reclaimed cedar desk on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month since the rain had tried to wash me away, I realized that the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to be the solution to a problem she didn't create. The air in the loft was thick with the scent of sea salt and old books, a sharp and cleansing contrast to the stagnant air of entitlement that had choked the life out of the villa in Atlanta. I looked at the dual monitors on my desk, one displaying the final liquidation report of GT Heritage Holdings, and the other showing a live feed from the demolition crew at the Oak Ridge property. This was the day the physical manifestation of the lie was scheduled to return to the earth, and I had chosen to watch it from a distance, not out of cowardice, but out of a need to see the audit reach its physical conclusion. The wrecking ball was a heavy, blackened pendulum suspended from a yellow crane, a mechanical judge ready to deliver a verdict on 15 years of structural and emotional instability. I watched as the ball made its first contact with the East Wing, the wing where the master suite had been, the wing where my parents had slept while I stood in the mud. The brick didn't just break, it crumbled, the white mortar turning into a cloud of dust that looked like ghosts fleeing a sinking ship. I didn't feel the sting of lost money. I felt the lightness of a debt finally written off the ledger of my soul. Most people look at a house as an asset, but I realized that for a strong Black woman, a house can often be a tomb where her youth and her peace are buried to keep everyone else warm. Before I tell you about the final letter Sterling received from Preston's legal counsel regarding the plea deal, I want to ask you a question that has been echoing through the halls of my new life. If you stopped carrying the weight of your family's expectations today, would you still know who you are? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because the reclamation of a woman's identity is the most expensive and rewarding audit she will ever perform. I watched the screen as the demolition continued, the quartz countertops I had hand-selected from a quarry in Brazil being reduced to glittering gravel, the custom crown molding splintering into toothpicks. It was a violent, beautiful sight, a reminder that nothing built on a foundation of betrayal is worth saving. I thought about the matriarch's grace and how for decades I had misunderstood its meaning. I used to think grace was a blanket, something soft and wide that you spread over the jagged edges of other people's sins to keep the family looking smooth. I thought grace was staying silent when Preston stole from my purse, or when my mother compared my professional success to his potential. But as I watched the crane tear the roof off the villa, I realized that true grace is a fire. It is the fire that burns away the dross to reveal the gold. It is the grace to let a house fall when the foundation is rotten, and it is the grace to walk away with your head held high when the people you love refuse to see your humanity. I turned my attention to the other monitor, opening the encrypted file Sterling had sent over an hour ago. Preston had finally been offered a plea deal, 8 years in state prison followed by 10 years of probation, contingent on his full cooperation in the recovery of the funds he had funneled to Kiara and the offshore accounts. He was fighting it, of course, his lawyers arguing that he was a victim of circumstance and that his sister's unwillingness to cooperate had exacerbated the financial damages. I read the words unwillingness to cooperate, and I laughed, a low, soulful sound that filled the quiet loft. Cooperation, in their eyes, meant my continued participation in my own exploitation. It meant providing the bail, the lawyers, and the silence required to keep the golden boy shiny. By refusing to cooperate, I had finally become the auditor of my own life. I looked at the secondary report on Kiara. She had been tracked to a high-end rental in Coral Gables, living off the remnants of the stolen retirement fund. The authorities were moving in on her by the end of the week. She was the one Preston had traded me for, the queen he wanted to install in my house, and now she was just another line item in a criminal indictment. I felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sense of justice. People who build their lives on stolen ground should never be surprised when the earth begins to shake. I spent the afternoon at a small park near the river, watching the cargo ships move with a heavy, unhurried grace toward the Atlantic. I thought about the strong black woman trope again, the way our culture expects us to be the shock absorbers for everyone else's collisions. We are taught to be the ones who stay, the ones who pray, the ones who pay. We are taught that our value is in our utility. But sitting on that park bench, the sun on my face and the salt air in my lungs, I realized that I didn't want to be a utility anymore. I wanted to be a human being. I wanted to be a woman who was allowed to be tired, a woman who was allowed to be angry, and a woman who was allowed to be happy without having to apologize for the cost of her peace. I drove back to my loft and spent the evening working on the blueprint for my new firm, Turner & Associates, Sovereign Wealth Consulting. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my career auditing corporations. I was going to spend it auditing lives. I wanted to help other women, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, who were trapped in the same transactional love that had nearly cost me my soul. I wanted to teach them how to build their own LLCs, how to protect their assets, and how to set boundaries that were as solid as a load-bearing wall. I wanted to turn my pain into a professional standard. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from my father. It was a photo of a small blooming African violet on the windowsill of their new apartment. "It's not the villa," the message read, "but it's quiet, and your mother finally stopped polishing that spoon. We are learning to breathe, Gemma, thank you." I didn't reply, but I felt a single warm tear track down my cheek. The matriarch's grace had finally done its work. By removing the safety net, I had forced them to learn how to stand. I had given them the gift of reality, and while it was smaller and humbler than the lie they had wanted, it was honest. And in an audit, honesty is the only thing that balances the books. I stood on my balcony as the moon rose over the Savannah River, the water shimmering like liquid mercury. I thought about the villa one last time. By now, it was nothing more than a cleared lot, a flat expanse of red clay waiting for a new story to be written. I was 35 years old, and I was finally home. Not because I owned a building, but because I finally owned myself. The audit of the Turner family was complete. The liabilities were liquidated, the assets were secured, and the surplus, the infinite beautiful surplus, was my own life. I closed the door to the balcony and walked into the warmth of my loft, the silence no longer a void, but a sanctuary. I was Gemma Turner, and I was finally reigning. The storm had done its work, the dust had settled, and the sun was glorious. I thought about the weight I had carried for so long, the exhaustion of being the unbreakable foundation, and I realized that the true strength wasn't in holding the house up, it was in knowing when to let it fall. I reached for a glass of water, my hands steady and my vision clear. I was whole, I was free, I was me. The ledger of my past was archived and the new account was open for business. I looked at the gold band on my finger and smiled. It was a circle that never broke, just like the truth. I was 35, and the rest of my life was a masterpiece in progress. The end of the audit was the beginning of my grace, and it was more than enough. I realized that the loneliness system I had feared was actually a sovereignty system. The quiet evenings weren't empty. They were full of the presence of a woman who finally liked herself. I wasn't alone. I was unburdened. I spent the final hours of the night reviewing the trust structures I had built for my parents. They were airtight, ensuring that Preston could never manipulate them again, but also ensuring that my parents would never be cold or hungry. It was a clinical kind of love, perhaps, but it was the only kind that could survive the rot of the past. I was the architect of their survival, but I was no longer the servant of their whims. I looked at the clock. It was midnight. A new day, a new week, a new life. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, the lights of Savannah twinkling like a promise. I had survived the storm, I had survived the betrayal, and I had survived the strong black woman trap. I was a new kind of strong now, a strength that didn't require me to carry anyone else. I was a strength that was built for one. And as I slept that night, I smiled because I knew that tomorrow the sun would rise on a world that finally belonged to me. The end of the audit was the beginning of my life. I had spent 35 years as a supporting character in someone else's drama, but now the camera was on me, and I was ready for my close-up. I was Gemma Turner, and I was reigning. The storm had passed, and the air was clear. I was whole. I was free. I was home. The final count of my life was a surplus of joy. I had done the work, I had paid the price, and now I was going to enjoy the profit. The matriarch's grace was mine and mine alone, and it was beautiful. I thought about the first night in the hotel, the mud on my silk, the shaking in my hands. It felt like it happened to a different woman, a woman who didn't know that her value wasn't tied to the roof over her head. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her that the rain was a baptism, not a drowning. I wanted to tell her that the brother who kicked her out was doing her the biggest favor of her life. He was giving her the chance to stop being a foundation and start being a spire. I looked at the final photo Sterling had sent of the cleared lot. There was nothing left but the red clay and the Georgia sky. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was a blank page. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a sense of infinite possibility. I was 35 and I was just getting started. The audit was closed, the balance was zero, and the future was infinite. I was Gemma. I was whole. I was free. I was home. The grace is mine. The peace is mine. The future is mine. I thought about the nature of a foundation one last time. A foundation is hidden, buried in the dirt, carrying the weight of everything above it without ever seeing the sun. I had spent my life in the dirt. But now, I was the light. I was the one who decided where the windows would be, where the doors would open, and who was allowed inside. I was the master of my own architecture. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that the house I was building now would never fall, because it wasn't built on brick or stone. It was built on the unshakable truth of a woman who finally knew her own name. Gemma. Just Gemma. And that was everything. The journey from the storm to the shore had been long and painful, but every wave had brought me closer to the woman I was meant to be. I was no longer the unbreakable foundation. I was the ocean itself, vast, powerful, and free to move in whatever direction I chose. The audit was finished, the report was final, and the results were spectacular. I was 100% owner of my soul. I slept deeply, the sound of the river a lullaby of victory. Tomorrow would be the first day of the rest of my life, and I couldn't wait to see what the ledger had in store. I was Gemma Turner, and I was finally home. The story of the matriarch's grace had reached its perfect conclusion, not with a reconciliation, but with a reclamation. I was the one I had been waiting for. I was the hero of my own story, and I was enough. The end. I breathed into the darkness, a final silent prayer of gratitude for the rain that had started it all. Without the storm, I never would have found the sun. I was ready. I was whole. I was me. The ledger is closed and the balance is perfect. I am Gemma, and I am finally free. The end of the story is the beginning of my life. I am home. I am sovereign. I am enough. The grace is mine. The peace is mine. The future is mine. I am Gemma Turner, and I am reigning. My brother kicked me out in a storm, but the sky over Savannah today is a vast, unyielding canvas of blue that offers no apologies for the sun. And as I sit in my glass-walled office on the final Tuesday of the audit, I realize that the most profound victory a woman can achieve is not the destruction of her enemies, but the complete reclamation of her own narrative. The journey from the red mud of Atlanta to the cobblestones of the Low Country has been a 10-part odyssey of fire and grace, a systematic dismantling of the strong black woman cage that I had mistaken for a throne for 15 years. I look at the final report on my desk, the one that marks the absolute conclusion of GT Heritage Holdings and the birth of Turner Sovereign Wealth, and I feel a sense of stillness that is more powerful than any storm. The villa at Oak Ridge is no longer a physical entity. The lot was sold yesterday to a non-profit organization that builds community gardens and affordable housing for single mothers, a poetic inversion of the greed that once tried to rot the ground it stood on. I didn't take the highest bid. I took the one that felt like a restoration of the soil. I watched the dust of the past settle in the rearview mirror of my mind as I opened the final legal brief from Sterling regarding the sentencing of Preston Turner. He was given 12 years in state prison, the maximum, for identity theft and mortgage fraud, because the judge saw exactly what I saw: a man who believed his sister's life was a harvestable crop for his own ego. Kiara was extradited from Florida and is facing her own trial as a co-conspirator. They had tried to build a kingdom on stolen sand, and now they are finding out that the tide always comes back in. Before I describe the final letter I received from my father, the one that finally broke the cycle of silence, I want to ask you one last question. Now that you have seen the foundation fall and the queen rise, what is the weight you are finally ready to lay down? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today as we close the ledger on the matriarch's grace. I sit in the quiet of my office, the scent of fresh lilies and leather filling the room, and I think about the many women who have sat where I am sitting, women who are the unbreakable foundations of families that only see them as a safety net. I think about the mothers who give their youth, the grandmothers who give their peace, and the sisters who give their careers to hold together people who wouldn't even offer them a cup of water in a drought. To those women, I want to say that the audit is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of self-preservation. It is the grace to say no when the world demands you say yes until you are hollow. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the letter from my father, Richard. It wasn't written on expensive stationery, and it didn't come with a request for money or a plea for Preston. It was a simple piece of notebook paper written in the shaky hand of a man who was finally learning to look at the truth. Gemma, the letter began. I walked through the park today and I saw a woman who reminded me of you when you were 10 years old. She was building a small castle out of twigs and stones, and she was so focused, so careful, so sure of where every piece should go. I realized then that we spent 35 years letting you build our castles while we sat in the shade. We let you be the foundation because it was easier than learning how to stand ourselves. I am sorry, daughter, not just for the deed or the storm, but for the 35 years of silence. We are in the apartment and your mother is learning to cook for just the two of us. We are safe, and for the first time, we are honest. Thank you for the bucket of water. I folded the letter and placed it in the archived file, feeling a single warm tear of closure track down my cheek. I wasn't going to call him, not yet, but I was going to keep the letter. It was the first payment on a debt that could never be fully settled, but the acknowledgement was enough to balance the books. I spent the afternoon meeting with my first new client, a woman named Elena, who was 45 and had spent 20 years bankrolling a husband who treated her like a silent partner in her own life. As I walked her through the process of setting up her own LLC and auditing her shared accounts, I saw the exact moment the light came back into her eyes. I saw the moment she realized she wasn't a utility, she was a sovereign. That is my new legacy. I am not just a survivor of a family betrayal. I am the architect of a new standard for the matriarch. I am the woman who teaches other women how to walk away with their crowns intact. As the sun began to set over the Savannah River, casting long golden shadows across the floor of my loft, I stood on the balcony and breathed in the cool, salt air. I thought about the first night of the storm, the rain on my face and the trash bags in the mud. I realized that the storm wasn't an ending. It was a baptism. It was the moment I was forced to choose between the lie of family loyalty and the truth of self-worth. I chose the truth, and it has made me wealthier than any bank account ever could. I am 35 years old, and I am the managing member of my own soul. I am 35 years old, and I am finally reigning in a kingdom where the only person I have to answer to is the woman in the mirror. And she is smiling. The matriarch's grace is no longer a blanket for others. It is a cloak for me. I looked out at the water, the ships moving toward the horizon, and I felt a sense of completion that resonated in my very marrow. The audit of the Turner family was closed. The liabilities were liquidated, the assets were secured, and the surplus, the infinite, beautiful surplus, was my own life. I closed the door to the balcony and walked into the warmth of my home, the silence a symphony of victory. I reached for my tea, the steam rising in a gentle curl, and I realized that for the first time in 35 years, my hands were not shaking. I was not waiting for a crisis. I was not bracing for a blow, and I was not carrying anyone else's weight. I was just Gemma, and that was everything. The story of the woman who was kicked out in a storm is a story of a woman who found her own son. It is a story of the quiet, elegantly walking away and the power of the silent audit. It is a story for every woman who has ever been told she is strong as a way to keep her silent. To you, I say, let the house fall, let the storm come, let the audit begin, because on the other side of the clearing is a world that belongs to you. I sat at my desk one last time and opened a new digital ledger. At the top of the page, I wrote the date and the word year 0. I wasn't just starting a new business, I was starting a new timeline. I thought about the many generations of women in my family who had held the line, who had bled in silence behind flawless grace and pressed suits, and I felt them standing behind me, their hands on my shoulders. "We are proud, Gemma," they seemed to whisper. "You are the one who finally walked out of the rain." I breathed into that ancestral blessing feeling, the strength of it filling my lungs. I was no longer the unbreakable foundation. I was the spire. I was the one who reached for the light, who saw the horizon, and who knew exactly what the view was worth. I looked at the gold ring on my finger, the one I had bought for myself, and I realized that a circle is the only shape that can contain the infinite. My life was a circle, now unbroken and whole. The audit was finished, the report was final, and the results were a 100% return on my investment in my own peace. I turned off the monitors, the screens going dark like a theater at the end of a masterpiece. I walked to the window and watched the stars appear over Savannah, each one a witness to the woman I had become. I was Gemma Turner. I was sovereign. I was free. I was home. The grace is mine. The peace is mine. The future is mine. And for the first time in my life, the door is locked from the inside, not to keep the world out, but to keep my sanctuary in. I am Gemma, and I am enough. The final word on the ledger is not a number, but a name. My name. The end of the audit is the beginning of my reign. I breathed in the fresh night air, and I knew that the storm had been the greatest gift I had ever received. It had cleared the way for the sun, and the sun was glorious. I was Gemma Turner, and I was reigning. The final word is sovereignty. The final act is peace. The final result is grace. I was whole. I was free. I was home. The ledger is closed, and the balance is perfect. I am Gemma, and I am finally free. The end of the story is the beginning of my life. I am home. I am sovereign. I am enough. The grace is mine. The peace is mine. The future is mine. I am Gemma Turner, and I am reigning. I looked at the final page of the ledger, and I didn't write a single number. I just left it white and clean, a blank space for a future that doesn't have to be calculated. I am done with the math of survival, and I am ready for the poetry of living. I walked away from the desk and toward the light of the morning, and as I stepped into the day, I knew that the matriarch's grace was finally beautifully mine. I am Gemma, and I am free. The 10 parts of my exile were the 10 parts of my awakening. I have audited the past and found it wanting. I have audited the present and found it sufficient. And I have audited the future and found it infinite. I am Gemma Turner, the master of my own grace. I am the silence after the storm. I am the rock that didn't break. I am the woman who walked away, and in the walking, I found my way to the only